hold on. What are we doing, Wong Wong, with Pheonix? Like, you're telling me that this character that pretty much everybody's complained about in recent time, you keep adjusting her, but you're just adjusting her to be a character we already have. Obviously, this is something that has been a general sentiment in the community as of late, I feel. Obviously, Phoenix may not be the most prominent concern that people have had with characters like Dino and Black Cat in recent times. However, Phoenix has been a bit of a problem child in general and consistently being considered one of the best DPS in the game. After all, she has like consistent damage and she has the abilities like Hela, but in general, they're almost better in every way. With the ultimate being one of those things that's debatably better than Hela's, but she also has like a little bit of healing here. She's got explosion damage. The way that her stuns work is a little bit different and more like instant, has more range, that type of thing. So they have differences, but there's a couple of aspects that I'd like to point out in this video of flaws that I think that they've done to Phoenix and how they failed her as a character in this game. The first thing that I want to discuss is going to be a general overview of what they've done with the character and why I don't like it. And then the second part is a bit more of a focus on what changes I think could make her a much more interesting character and mayhaps more balanced. Let's hop right in. So, the first thing I wanted to focus on is she used to be a unique character. She had very quick damage fall off for a hit scan. She had AoE with her explosions. She had a fun little melee weave that you could use. And she really required this almost aggressive gameplay because of that quick damage fall off, as well as the melee marking targets. It encouraged you to melee weave. Of course, now she's more or less like Hela. She has similar kill times and damage when you count the explosions. Both characters have AoE, even though Hela's requires a kill to get the explosion. Both have an escape tool with iframes, Phoenix with her shift, and also Hela with her shift as well. Both have a stun. The biggest difference is mobility option. Where Phoenix has her like Phoenix fly thing, Hela more or less has to rely on her shift ability, which is her escape tool to get to high ground. Of course, in exchange, Hela gets a more tank buster like ability with her right click, doing large chunks of damage with delayed explosions. But in the end, though, Phoenix just feeds off of tanks because of their large hitbox as well as guaranteed headshot, and their ultimates being the other difference. Overall, though, I just simply feel like they completely gutted her uniqueness, and even though that she's still really strong, that's not necessarily a good thing all the time. Because whenever a character gets rid of their like fundamentals, to me, it's kind of sad. And essentially, what they've done is they've slowly taken away aspects of her identity. With the most recent patch, they like nerfed her healing, which nobody was complaining about. And I, in fact, thought that she needed more healing. After all, playing her, the healing is more or less non existent. And even whenever you cause multiple explosions, it's not like it increases the healing, it just increases how long it's active. But with how many explosions you cast, it's more or less non existent because you just always have the healing. But even more so, later on, they reduced her damage fall off. Or earlier on, I should say, they reduced her damage fall off. They reduce her damage of her explosions, but like increased her single target damage for some reason, as if she didn't feel good at doing that already. Whenever a explosions should be a like big focus on this character, whenever that's like her main mechanic, but instead they emphasize more of the single target just hitting him for some reason. Furthermore, too, they removed her melee marking targets with the sparks, which just didn't make sense. The only part that was like busted back then was the Beyblade combo, but they nerfed that, so it didn't make sense to get rid of the melee marking targets, with the only argument I could think of being that like she was better against dive, than she needed to be for a poke character. But you're also telling me that the character has damage fall off starting at 10 meters, and it's not fine for her to do good damage within that range? To me, that never made sense. So that'll be a point that I'm going to try to emphasize later on. In the end, though, my view is that on release, she was an aggressive poke character that required you to play at closer range and have a presence when characters dove, almost making her like a more of a brawl poke character. Instead, now she almost plays slow in a sense, and she plays like far away back, even though she has damage fall off. It's like borderline non-existent, and you just hold left click for the entire game, hoping that you eventually get a kill or a bunch of explosion. Lastly, before we get started, I'll point out that the passive team up damage boost that she gets is honestly a large part of the problem with the character right now. A lot of her damage is like tuned very well, but whenever you add the 10% damage boost, it immediately like looks overpowered. Like all of her numbers just skyrocket. Even though it's only 10%, it is very noticeable to say the least. Especially since she shoots twice a second for some reason. That's something for another video about how characters who poke shoot extremely fast for no reason, with Punisher likely being one of the biggest offenders, having a shotgun that shoots 1.5 shots a second, because that makes sense for a ability that does over 300 damage. For some reason, normally whenever it does that much damage, you'd think it would take a second and a half instead, rather than 1.5 shots per second. Nonetheless, that's another rant video. For now, though, I wanted to discuss some solutions to this problem, some ways to make her feel unique again, some ways that also kind of solidify her spot in the DPS category rather than just being a knockoff Hela, or rather a better Hela. Nonetheless, there's nothing wrong with having a character that like fits similar niches, but to me this one just doesn't make sense to fit a similar niche, especially with how they initially designed the character. Thus, first, I want to revert most of the changes she's gotten and even buff some of them, as funny as that sounds. So I'm going to work a little bit in reverse, and I want to discuss her healing a little bit, since that was the most recent change that really got me. For some reason, they changed it from 10 to 5 healing per second, which again is just weird to me. But nonetheless, I feel like she needs to be fairly self sustaining. And unlike other DPS now who just click a button and get overhealth, if it relies on healing, a passive healing as well, I feel like you can reasonably make it somewhat good, especially based on some of these later changes that we'll talk about. So don't worry too much whenever you hear how busted, in quotes, this sounds. But first, we're going to bring her healing after causing an explosion from 5 to 10, what it used to be. Furthermore, we'll add some extra points to this. First, extra explosions don't just make it last longer, they also increase the amount of healing up to 3 times, eventually offering 30 healing per second after each of her explosions, while also offering diminishing returns for that time that it lasts. So, yes, it is about Ultron level healing, but it is only to herself. And it is as you'll see later, it's going to be a lot harder to get than it used to be. But essentially, what this would look like is whenever you get your first explosion, you get 10 healing for 4 seconds. And if you can cause a second explosion in that time, it adds 3 seconds and the healing becomes 20. So if, for example, it takes you 3 seconds to get the next explosion, you then get 4 seconds because it adds 3 to the 1 second that you had left, and you get 4 seconds of 20 healing. If you that third one in that time again, let's say you end at once or get the explosion at 1 second. This time, however, instead of adding 3, it adds 2. So then you get 3 seconds of the max healing, 30 healing. So 3 consecutive explosions can quickly give you 30 healing per second, and it would likely max out at like 8 to maybe 10 seconds if you did get that many explosions. Now, again, I'll emphasize that there's kind of two parts to giving her healing that's more or less on this level of Ultron's drone. That being that her damage output at base is going to be a little bit lower, and her explosion consistency is in fact going to be reduced. In terms of her base damage, I want to um, like have this emphasis on explosions. So this part's going to bleed into that a little bit. But I want her primary to act less like a damage option and more like a debuffing tool almost. So we keep the damage fall off similar to what it is, but we're going to be a little more aggressive on how fast it damage fall offs. So instead of it stopping at like 75 or whatever it is right now, it goes all the way down to 60% of the damage, maybe even a little bit lower if we really wanted. But the reason I only say 60 is because her base damage is also going to be reduced to 40, a fairly big jump to say the least, from her 55 damage she has currently. However, something I'll note is that it has an added effect to the sparks that cause 10 damage per second as like a tick effect. So just by hitting them, you casually start doing 10 damage a second. Now, as for her sparks and her explosions, as I mentioned already, they'll do a passive 10 damage per second just by having the sparks. And this means that the focus is going to be on creating these sparks. So essentially, what you need to do first is instead of it causing 3 sparks to cause an explosion, it's now going to be 5. What this does is it encourages you to hit your shots first, and it requires more shots because a character that shoots 2.5 times almost a second should not be able to cause explosions as fast as she does. On top of the fact that her base damage is low, as well as the tick damage, it kind of is like this. It's like this progressive damage is how it works. Is it? She does base damage, a little bit of in between damage, and then a beefier explosion in the end. So it's like almost like a bell curve in a sense where it kind of starts mid, drops, dips, and then goes really high. Of course, though, 5 could also just be a little much. So you could have different options of like maybe extending the time that the marks last, or just like as you'll see later, me mention again, maybe her melee marks targets again because that genuinely just makes the most sense. Nonetheless, the other part too of having 5 marks is that the third spark is going to have like this ramp up effect. I don't as funny as it sounds, I didn't really want to take too much from Onron, but as I from Overwatch, but as I was making this, the more I was like, man, this just sounds kind of like Onron. In the end, though, this is just my idea for the character, so it doesn't matter if it's like Onron. Essentially, though, at 3 stacks or 3 sparks, the you fan the flame more or less, creating a 20 damage per second, essentially offering the option to keep people at 3 stacks, which gives you the consistent 20 damage per second, helping you charge your ult, or you can just end it really quick by causing the explosion. As for the final explosion, there's a couple of parts to this. So easily now you can increase the damage, as considering that it's a little harder to get them, as well as since this is like your bread and butter now, since your melee or since your primary won't do much damage, so we're going to buff the explosion damage to the target that explodes from like 35 all the way up to 50, if not even 60, as well as the surrounding targets maybe like only 20 damage, which isn't a huge difference compared to what it is now. But the reason that I only say 20 is because since it applies the spark, it does effectively apply the tick damage as well. I also will point out an interesting thought is rather than the explosions doing a set amount of damage, it could do a small base damage as well as adding the damage based on how much burn effect that is left on the sparks, essentially encouraging you to focus one target to cause explosions while equalizing the value from creating chain explosions. So if you take the time to set up a bunch of people with sparks to cause this like chain explosion, it won't necessarily kill all of them, but it like and like you're more or less encouraged to just shoot one person. But again, I kind of mentioned I don't necessarily want her to be like a Hela, like shoot one person, but at the same time, mayhaps even the inverse as to the more sparks that like are in the explosion, the more damage it does. That way, it's actually encouraging her to uh, like be smarter about like creating chain explosions. Nonetheless, the rest of her kit is in a reasonable spot, in my opinion. With maybe the only thing I'd like to see is a range increase on the explosion on her shift. After all, her shift's explosion is more or less useless, and you like borderline never even get to mark a target with it because of how small the explosion is. Some final notes that I will point out for these adjustments that I would love to see is this keeps her far more focused on some of her original features, while also keeping her an aggressive poke character, as well as taking more time and mental energy to create explosion chains as a focus on the character, rather than just single target damage that they've kind of like shifted towards. Overall, her self healing, while sounding overpowered to give a character consistent 30 healing per second, take note in how much longer it takes to activate the explosions. This makes it a little difficult to reach the max 30 healing per second while encouraging smarter spark placements to rather than just a spray and pray type gameplay that she used to have. Now you have to be smart about which people you're marking. That way you can maybe create a couple of chains at once so you can get that max healing guaranteed. Otherwise, you'll probably just end up being stuck at like 10 healing per second because of how many sparks you need to do to get that healing. The next part, I haven't talked about her ultimate yet, so this will be a quick note on her ultimate. While I don't necessarily think it needs much of any changes per se, the main thing is if there are 5 sparks, it probably would need to apply 2 rather than 1, which it does now. Furthermore, with all the healing as well as burn damage that I've discussed implementing into the character, her ult charge will probably need to be increased to compensate. Even with it not particularly being a great ult, with her being a stat farmer similar to like Ultron in that sense, it would need to be pretty cost heavy, purely because of how fast she can get it in theory. So as a conclusion, I find Pheonix is currently not enjoyable and unique enough compared to Hela. Especially as the patch notes have progressed, their method of fixing her was to get rid of most of what made Pheonix special. Thus, the changes listed above in this video make her unique and focus on her being this aggressive AoE poke character that she used to be, that needs to be close to her targets to get the most value while also requiring aim to get the AoE damage. The aggression comes from the having high damage fall off and lower primary fire damage. In exchange, her sparks deal tick damage while also requiring more sparks to cause the explosion, as well as the option for an in between with 3 stacks causing the tick damage to be increased if you wish. This makes her great into crowds with enough single target damage to feel relevant, but not too powerful against divers or other poke characters. In the end, I would love to see these changes like this, or at least similar, with her being different from Hela, as I find focusing more on what mechanics she was given at launch rather than just straight damage per shot would be ideal. Sometimes the devs need to realize that not every character needs to kill in less than a second. Sometimes a character that has reasonable self-sustain, some crowd control, a presence with their AoE damage would be good for the game. Even if she isn't getting a ton of final blows on enemies, the enemy team will be in constant fear between the tick damage and the stronger explosions of constantly not being at max health, as that's more or less what these changes would offer, is presence for the character that isn't, oh, I'm going to get 2 tapped if I stay out of cover for too long. These may not be perfect changes either, so feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know what y'all think of Pheonix below. I hope y'all enjoyed this yap, and feel free to join me in the next discussion about the stats and scoreboard adjustments I think would be cool to see. And if you're interested in character concepts for Rivals, join me for the next character concept video over Nightcrawler. Lastly, if you are at all interested in a fun thought experiment over the game Destiny, my next video will be a broad coverage of classes in our make believe Destiny 3. Otherwise, have a good one.